All right, on today's podcast, we are going to dive in to some stats that really kind of end up defining the entire Nets season. Most of them a little bit alarming. A couple that we can point to the future to say, hey, maybe things weren't as bad as we thought they were going to be. But there's definitely some stats here that when we dive into it, really tell the story of how this year went. We're going to talk about all of it. But first, the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Doug Norrie, owner-operator DFSR.com. If you need some projections for the NBA while it's still going on, MLB, NFL when the season comes up, and everything else in between, head on over to DFSR.com. No Adam Armbrecht today as we roll through the offseason. That's all right. We're going to roll solo on this guy and bring to you some stats that I thought just a bunch of different stuff, stats, not necessarily even all on the court stuff, but that ended up really telling the tape of this past season for the Nets. It came to really just through looking at a few numbers. I think we can kind of sum up what happened with this Nets team. And in some ways, it's some of them are troubling. Some of them are kind of enlightening. And then others, you want to say maybe it's correctable for next season. And maybe the Nets don't have as much to worry about going into the 2022-2023 season as maybe we thought, depending where you are on, your levels of concern, your levels of crisis, your levels of hope, your levels of, optimism, pessimism, wherever you are. I think you're going to kind of look at some of these stats and hear them and say, okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. Or, oh, wow, I can't believe that was the case. As always, thanks for making Locked On Nets your first listen of the day. We are free and available on all platforms. Also available on YouTube, Locked On Nets. All those links will be in the show notes, so go make sure you check that out. So I started to look at just kind of like trying to get a bird's eye view of this past season, trying to look at some different stuff in terms of how the Nets season sort of unfolded on a macro level. We all know the micro stories, right? We all know, okay, vaccine stuff at the beginning of the season, Kyrie Irving sits out. We know James Harden, you go back to those final games of the season, of his season of the Nets and, stuff that led into the trade deadline and Ben Simmons. We know about the KD injury. We know, obviously, Simmons gets traded, never ends up making his debut as a Net. We know all the stories, right? Remember the timeline during the year when it was like a bunch of G Leaguers and randoms were playing on the team because half the league was out in COVID protocols. It was a crazy season, no doubt about it. Crazy season. So much stuff going on. Felt like, from a Nets perspective, if it could go wrong, it did go wrong. So I think just on a narrative level, there's very few wins. I think there's a couple of nice things you can look at in terms of how the season shook out. But in terms of, if we're trying to tell nice stories about the season, it's kind of hard to go and find where those were. So I'm definitely here for that. Look, we spent the whole year covering the team. We know exactly how it went. We know all the stories. We dissected every story a million times over. But I wanted to go through and look at some different stuff, how the Nets compared, just how their season, like I said, on a macro level compared to just some of the other teams. Like how, in terms of consistency, in terms of some different stats, where the Nets landed. And so the first thing I did was one story that we had for a lot of the season was how many different starting lineups the Nets had. It felt like they had a million different starting lineups, right down to the point where they started a playoff lineup that had never played together, right? Like, or maybe they played like 10 minutes together or something like that prior to the playoffs. Some staggering number that was really alarming when you looked at it. So I went through every team and looked at 5-man lineups for the entire NBA over the course of last year. And one thing that really stood out was we knew that the Nets had an inconsistent season in terms of who they had on the court. But when you look at it really compared to some of the rest of the league, it becomes even more stark and kind of weird. And like I said, tells the story of the season. So the Nets had two 5-man lineup over the 5-man lineups over the course of the entire year that played more than 100 minutes together. Two. two groups of 5 that played more than 100 minutes. The first one was James Harden, Joe Harris, Bruce Brown, Blake Griffin, Kevin Durant. That lineup played a total of 171 minutes together. Okay. Well, what do we know about that team? Those guys. One, Harden wasn't even on the team at the end of the year, and Blake Griffin was essentially buried until they, broke glass in case of emergency in the playoffs, brought him out for some hero minutes in the playoffs, but he was essentially buried before that. That was the most played lineup, most played 5-man combination during the course of the year. Their second most was, a little getting there a little closer in terms of what you want to see. That was Kyrie Irving, Seth Curry, Kevin Durant, Bruce Brown, Andre Drummond. We know that team, that was more kind of like fit the what they did going into the playoffs. That lineup played 135 minutes during the regular season together. 119 offensive rating, 117 defensive rating, got totally torched on the defensive end in those 135 minutes. They had no other combination of 5 players that played more than 100 minutes together. And in fact, the next closest one was at 94 minutes. And then it, by the way, really falls off a cliff in regular season. That lineup was James Harden, off the team. DeAndre Bembry, off the team. Patty Mills, great. LaMarcus Aldridge, essentially off the team by the end of the year. And Kevin Durant. That is where we stand with how these lineups ended up playing together. And then you got to drop all the way down to 59 minutes when it comes to the next closest one. I'm not going to go through all the 5-man combinations. This is mostly just to say that these guys just never played together. They never got 5 lineups, 5 men together in a lineup at any point during the season, really. That's how inconsistent, that's how up and down, that's how all over the roster was over the course of the year, that they just could never even pull together 5 men at a time that could play consistently together. And if you compare it to the rest of the league, not to, go through every single team here, there was one team that had fewer than 100 minutes for any 5-man lineup. That was the Lakers. That team was all over the place with injuries, obviously, to LeBron, to AD. They could never get like that 4th and 5th man going correctly. So that obviously they didn't make the playoffs. So that I guess we're not as bad as the Lakers in this respect. So great news there. They had 89 minutes was their top lineup. And then there was one other team that was the Kings that had 117 minutes as their top one. Again, that team completely stunk. They shook everything up at the trade deadline. Got rid of Halliburton at all. And they had some injuries also. So you don't really want to be compared to these other teams in terms of these 5-man lineups for sure. And then in terms of just comparatively, 39 different lineups over the entirety of the NBA. 39 had 5-man lineups that played more than the Nets' biggest one, 171. 39 lineups. You don't need to be a math wizard to know that means multiple teams had 5-men combinations just among themselves that were better than what the Nets were throwing out. And from a consistency level, that's just it's not tolerable. Like it's never going to work. How can it work? How can you get these groups of players together that don't really play together? Yeah, there's context. I get it. Trade deadline, context. Vaccination stuff, context. Injuries, context. All for sure. But even the role players we saw getting mixed up over the course of the year, right? I'm going to talk about some of this in a second, but it's not like there was consistency even outside of those big names. We saw multiple lineup changes. We saw different guys being shuffled in and out of the lineups. We saw just, Nash relying on certain players at some times and then kind of burying them at others. So it's not like there was a consistency around some of the role players either. It was just completely all over the place. So when you compare it to some of the other teams that are out there, by the way, you want to hear like the teams that are in the finals now. Boston, their top lineup played 443 minutes, so nearly 4 times as much. Even Golden State, for all their stuff with Clay and their injury stuff, they had a lineup that out there that 347 total minutes together. So these teams, that made it pretty far, saw a lot more consistency. Denver had a 761 minute lineup, right? Phoenix had a big one too, 754. So these are the teams that made it far. The teams that showed consistency over the course of the season got farther in the playoffs if they had enough horses. So one thing the Nets just need to cure up is just very simple. Sometimes it's not as simple as saying it, but curing the lack of consistency among the rotations is just going to be absolutely critical for what they do next season. Got some more stats want to break out for you that kind of tell the tale of the tape for the Nets. First, going to talk to you about our friends over at Rock Auto. Rock Auto is for all you do-it-yourselfers out there. You're dealing with your car. There's tons of makes, there's tons of models, trucks, cars. It's all there. Go into the local chain auto parts store. can be kind of a disaster. Not when you shop at rockauto.com, where you're going to get 30 or even 50% better savings than those local places. And absolutely forget about going to the dealership. It's a family business. They're serving the do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. The prices are reliably low for every single customer, so no worries there. And they have everything you need: brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, carpets, all there for you at rockauto.com. Go to rockauto.com to see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On and How Did You Hear About Us box, so to know that we sent you amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car or truck will ever need. rockauto.com. All right, so we talked about the we talked about the lineup stuff and the combination pieces and how just the lack of consistency ended up sort of, I think, burying the Nets. We can point back to a lot of different things with how the season went, but I do think that piece of it, just the lack of consistency, really does kind of sum up a lot of what the problem is. There are other numbers I want to point to here in a second, but just to reiterate that the problem when we look at these teams that had sort of remarkable consistency over the season by choice, look, sometimes you're going to get the Thunders of the world and the Pacers of the world who are just in the tank and they're just going to be inconsistent number, even though the Thunder did have one lineup that played a decent amount together. But for the most part, like that, those teams near the end are trying to lose, tank for position, blah, blah, blah. The good teams, are able to deal with a little bit of injury luck. They're able to just sort of know their roles among their players. They have a very clear vision of how the team is going to break down. And that just makes things a lot easier when it comes to maintaining consistency and then getting reps together over the course of the season. We know that basketball is, a repeatable process. You want to be able to make sure that guys just get a lot of reps together. That is going to end up helping, especially when you have guys as talented as Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, and then really, solid role players like Seth Curry. I'll even throw Drummond in there, and like in terms of just, veteran guys that sort of get it, even if, their skill sets are, have a ceiling in terms of how far they're going to get you. We know that Joe Harris kind of fits that mold too. We're going to hope that Ben Simmons does as well too, that like just time on task ends up becoming sort of the way just, ends up curing a lot of the stuff. But there was a problem with the Nets had this season beyond just the inconsistency, is that you can just make the case that they simply over the course of the season just didn't have enough talent. Like if we look at, sometimes talent is tough to evaluate on a statistical level. Can't just look at points and assists and rebounds all the time because that's going to pile up for some teams and not for others. Although, some of it's going to tell the story. Some is just eye test. Like you can just kind of tell when you watch some of these guys play, just how good they are comparatively with the rest of the league. But if you look at, some stats, and there are analytics places out there, Win Shares does this, WAR does it through Raptor, there's VORP, there's PER. There are a lot of stats that kind of do start to synthesize, the skill levels of certain players over the course of the NBA. And I think when we look at this, we're going to see, especially around the cumulative pieces, that the Nets just didn't have enough talent, frankly, to the point where it's kind of amazing based on where some of their other players landed, that they even made it as far as they did, getting swept by the Celtics in the first round, which feels crazy to say, hey, they made it far, but they've made it farther, but than they should have. But if you look at some of this other stuff in terms of their, analytics, they just really didn't seem to have enough guys over the course of the season. Yeah, and that sort of dovetails with the lineup piece as well. But, let's just look at win shares first on Basketball Reference. The top two guys, obviously, in this are kind of running away with it. Jokic, top three guys. Top three guys, Jokic, Giannis, and Embiid. Those guys are like, in the running for the MVP this season. Those numbers make a lot of sense. Jokic completely kind of almost like lapped these guys, by the way. He was so much further ahead of them. And then, and it's a cumulative stat. So being able to play in a lot of games is going to help you. Kevin Durant ends up 15th in win shares over the course of the season, 8.4. His win shares per 48 look a little bit better than some of this other group that he just was only able to play 55 games. Most of these other guys above on the list are in the mid 60s to high 70s in terms of games played. So they're just going to be able to rack up a few more win shares. But the problem is, so we kind of know this around Durant. The problem after that is the Nets just had like nobody else that ranked in this stuff at all. Okay. Some of it is because of context. Harden was ranked 22nd over the course of the season, 65, but the Nets didn't have all that time from him. So you can't really count it. You can count it for when he was there. You have to feel like the way he was playing with the Nets before he sort of, miraculously had a resurgence with the Sixers, that I don't know, maybe it wouldn't have looked as good because he was just pouting and didn't want to be there anymore. He ends up 22nd, but again, that doesn't really count for the Nets because when the season was over, he wasn't on the team. You have to go all the way down to 92nd. Oh, by the way, Drummond comes in at like 79th, but again, the Nets didn't have his services for part of the season, so that kind of negates some of itself. You have to go all the way down to 92nd to Bruce Brown to find the next guy in terms of win shares that the Nets had on their team. 92nd. That's insane. Now, his win shares per 48, and if you do it that way, he bumps up on the list into the 50s. But I'll tell you the problem with that number. The problem with the win shares per minute piece is Bruce Brown, while he's your second overall guy in win shares, was a guy that the Nets, for some reason, couldn't even see fit to playing a lot to start the season when he was totally buried. So you think, okay, great. He was able to accumulate some stats in the games that he ended up playing and able to make an impact. But the Nets and their coaching staff and front office couldn't even see fit to play him early in the season. That's almost just as alarming. Now, granted, they ended up getting there and they ended up figuring it out before it was all said and done. So I guess that's good. But this was a guy that was already on the team that they just basically, again, buried at the end of the bench to start the season. He ends up 92nd on the team in win shares. Like I said, it goes to the 50s if you sort by per minute, and you're getting really, really quality minutes out of him near the end of the season. But again, like the list of guys above them, just because they played more and played more consistently, is just completely crazy. And so, I mean, how, when you're a team, can you expect to like be at a high level when this is like sort of what you're dealing with, right? And it all kind of comes out together. Like these pieces do tie in together for specific reasons: the inconsistency, the lack of playing time, the injuries, all this other stuff. But like, and then by the way, you really, really start getting into the dregs. Nick Claxton's at 140 in win shares. Kyrie actually sneaks in there at 148 in only 29 games. Great, he got to end up playing. He would have finished obviously much, much, much higher if he had played the whole season, but he didn't play the whole season. Like when you look back at the season, you have to say who actually played and who didn't. And then 158 is LaMarcus Aldridge, and now you're getting into just, average to below average players kind of landing in these ranges. You just can't, it's going to be so hard to sustain a championship level peak performance when not only are you getting inconsistent play, but then frankly, the rest of the guys on the team just aren't that good. They just aren't that good. That's what's going to happen when you're a top heavy roster. When you're built on superstars and max contracts, you are going to have to, find value in the edges. That's okay. That's okay. You have Kevin Durant. It was supposed to be Kevin Durant, James Harden, Kyrie Irving. We knew that those three together with a couple other role players could win a championship, I think. I think that's a very, very fair thing to say. But they had so much other stuff happen to them this year that, they trade away Harden. Simmons never plays. Kyrie sits out more than half the season. And now all of a sudden, who are you dealing with? You're dealing with role players and worse. And it's going to be so hard to maintain championship caliber play when, again, not only are your lineups, inconsistent, but then your play is just kind of subpar. And these numbers are backed up by, it's not just Basketball Reference here. Like Raptor rating is kind of in the same zone for some of these guys, and I know these are calculated differently. Kevin Durant still finishes near the top in Raptor. He was I think he was top 10. Yeah, let's see. Oh, sorry, I just had it in front of me. I'll find it in a second. I'm pretty sure he was top 10. And then, he was 21. And then Kyrie ended up finishing actually all the way up at 80th, but they're factoring, I think, how much great he was on offense. And then you get Bruce Brown down at 119, and that's kind of it when it comes to Raptor rating. So even though the numbers kind of shake out a little differently depending on where you look, all these guys end up kind of falling in the same range. It's not like typically you're not going to have, one guy completely outstrip the other guys in terms of the very, very top of these lists. Sometimes you'll get outliers and kind of weird ways that they shake out. But for the most part, these lists are going to mostly agree with each other. There's only so many ways to really slice it up when it comes to statistics. So we need to have players that generate wins. Really, honestly, when you look at how this team was made up, know how much time that Durant missed, know how much time Kyrie missed, know that you basically got a part of a season out of Harden and nothing out of Simmons. It kind of actually starts to feel like a miracle. They were 44 and 38 and in the 7th seed. Like it feels like they almost should have been worse. I know it didn't feel like that at the time. At the time, we're saying to ourselves, what's happening with this team? They're a championship level team. They need to be playing better. But when you take a bird's eye view of the scope of the entire season, it's a little easier to say to yourself, whoa, maybe they outperformed expectation based on what they actually had on the court over the course of the year. Again, you can really only do that when you look back. It's really hard to do that when you're in the moment looking at something, because you see Kevin Durant, you see Kyrie Irving, and you want to say, this team should be in the championship. And yeah, they had those guys at the end of the season. So you can set out a whole season and then get all your best players back, and the season stats aren't going to matter. But we're trying to tell a story about this whole season. And I think that these are the pieces that end up really kind of putting the narrative kind of back together when it comes to the Nets. We're going to talk a little bit more, maybe some more positive stuff when it comes to the Nets. First, going to talk to you about our friends over at Bet Online. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all of your betting needs, all of the sports info that you could ever hope to dream of. Bet Online has live odds for really every sport. They have the money lines, the over-unders. I'm using that every single day with baseball projections. They have the fights on the weekends, NFL futures. Bet Online is just your one-stop shop, okay? All the trends, all the action, all the sports wagering information you need is over at betonline.net. Head on over there right now. Bet Online, where the game starts. Okay, let's finish this off with some positives and what we can take into the next season in terms of like what kind of went well for the Nets. I know a lot of this is sort of doom and gloom, but I mean, in some ways it's not. Like in some ways, sometimes consistency is an easy thing to cure. And sometimes that, injuries just kind of go your way for a year. Sometimes, some city doesn't randomly choose to mandate something that one of their players can't do, and you can run good that way. Like there are a lot of these things that do seem fluky. I know the Nets stuff kind of ends up seeing fluky year over year, and that can feel frustrating. It's like, hey, fluky for the guys to get hurt in the playoffs, and fluky for, the Kyrie thing to happen, and fluky for the Ben Simmons piece to not play. Like a lot of these can seem like one-offs. I know when it piles together for Nets fans, it can feel like it's just something that happens to your team all the time. I'm here to tell you that's just kind of not what happens. Like a lot of this stuff ends up evening out. Sometimes you don't have enough time for it to even out. Sometimes, the teams break up or guys just move on or whatever it is. So I get that, like, it's not always consistent in terms of it doesn't always, the coin doesn't always flip back your way enough in the short term to be able to make up for it. So I 100% get that. But yeah, I think we can say some of this is fluky. When you look at some other stuff, just in terms of teams and in the offense, I thought some interesting stats for the Nets this year that like ended up being pretty good, even though the team was unbelievably inconsistent. Their effective field goal percentage for the season was 54%. That ranked 11th in the league. 11th in the league in effective field goal percentage. And then in terms of true shooting, they were right there too. They were 11th in true shooting. And you're like, okay, well, 11th. Is that good? Well, okay, it was almost top 10. Yeah, I can do the math on that. And they're, basically we're tied with the Sixers in terms and the Celtics in terms of the percentage points. So they're like right there in terms of true shooting to be essentially a top 10 team. But you're like, man, for a team that dealt with so much inconsistency over the course of the season, all those lineup changes, all these guys in and out, lack of talent, maybe being able to play enough together that we saw with the win shares as a cumulative stat. Even with all that, the Nets were like bordering on an elite offense. That's pretty tough to do. And if you look at true shooting kind of does tell you a lot of what you needed to know about the season. Nuggets, Jazz, Heat, Warriors, Suns, these are all playoff teams. These are the top ones. Celtics a little lower at 9, but we know the defense was so incredible that they get, extra credit. They can not be as good on offense when they are elite on defense. You can give up some stuff on the offensive end if you're going to make sure that you stop the other team from ever scoring. So that's kind of how the Celtics shook out. By the way, defensive rating for the season, take a guess at who was number 1 and 2. Boston Celtics number 1, Golden State Warriors number 2. That's sometimes that will tell you the whole story about where you need to be near the end of the season. You got a really good defense, you got a good defensive rating, you are probably going to be near the very top of the league when it's all said and done. So but going back to the true shooting and the effective field goal percentage, we know that the Nets team is going to, with Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, is going to make their bones on offense. That's what they want to do. When they had Harden, that was the plan. That was like, okay, you have two subpar defenders in Harden and Kyrie. It's not going to matter because the offense is going to be so overwhelming that the other teams won't even have a chance. Sure, they can only score 2 points. We'll score 3, right? Like you score 2 points, we'll get 2 points in an and one. Like that's kind of how the net we'll get a stop every once in a while. You'll never stop us. That was the sort of the thesis around how the Nets were going to get you. I still think that is part of it. When you have Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving on your team, offense is going to always be your primary weapon. Like that's always going to be the thing you lean on, and you should. These guys are generational offensive talents, and we saw that with even with the way that the season shook out with not having all the same guys around, and maybe even just guys who weren't, in terms of NBA standards, always up to snuff, getting major minutes for this team. Oh, by the way, didn't even mention they lost Joe Harris for most of the season, a guy who's always going to make your offense better. Like when you put all this together, to have this team still rank top 10 for a couple like key indicators of how good your offense is going to be, you have to really, really like it. And I think that is what we can kind of hold our breath on, hold our hat on, whatever you want to hold something on going into next season, is that if they can cure some of these other pieces, if we can just get lucky, can we have a season where all these guys play? Can we have a season where something fluky doesn't go wrong? Because when that happens, this Nets team's awesome. That's it. Even throw Simmons in there. Throw the unknown of Simmons in there. I just told you there was a bunch of unknowns from this last year who definitely weren't as good as Ben Simmons. Those guys were not as good as Ben Simmons, and they were kind of unknowns, and the Nets still kind of had a pretty good season. Make Simmons a little worse than he was with the Sixers, right? Have him just be kind of a player that just is long and can dribble the ball a little bit and handle the ball and initiate some offense, get out in transition. Don't even have him be like that kind of upper level player that he was last year. You're still going to see the Nets being really good, because I just told you they were playing with guys that weren't up to this caliber over the course of the season, and they were still, for the most part, treading water / better than average. And they get swept in the playoffs by the Celtics. It happens. Okay. It's water under the bridge at this point. Nothing you do about it. The Celtics made it to the championship. So something, how bad can it really look? I know that folks don't want to hear that. But you replace some of these guys with just, average to just, replacement level or better players for some of these minutes. And you're just going to see this Nets team sort of be where they were when Kevin Durant got hurt, which was near the top of the Eastern Conference. This is a team that was at the top of the Eastern Conference for long stretches of the season until all went off the rails. It's hard to remember that now because of how bad it went, but that's kind of where they were. So when I look at some of these markers, some of these metrics, I am feeling a little bit more encouraged. I do feel like there's a world where some of this stuff just kind of, works itself out. It has to, right? Got to have the universe kind of come on your side every once in a while. Let's get Kyrie Irving back in the contract. Let's get Ben Simmons back from the back surgery. Let's make a couple offseason moves. We see Claxton come back on the RFA stuff. Maybe they spend a little money for Bruce Brown. You know what you have, a player or two. That's all you need. That it really is all you need. And after looking at the inconsistency, looking at the turmoil and the overturn or the turnover that they had with the roster, and then combine it with where they ended up at the end of the season with some of these metrics, you kind of have to feel pretty encouraged. So I think that's where I stand right now. We'll keep diving into the numbers, obviously. As of this recording, just a little housekeeping thing. The Nets, I recorded on the middle of the day on Wednesday. The Nets had not made a decision on the Philadelphia 76ers draft pick. I think the continued speculation was that they were going to defer to next year. That could be different. If they do change their mind on that, Adam and I will definitely kind of update that on Friday's podcast for sure. And then we'll still be rolling through the offseason, covering all this stuff, looking for signs of hope with the Nets, figuring out who they should add, what the draft can look like, trades they can make. All this stuff is stuff we're going to have you covered for. In the meantime, make sure you subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts. We're free and available over there, always keeping you free on all these places. You just help us out by subscribing. Hit subscribe over to that YouTube channel. Watch a YouTube video or two. That is how we keep the show free every single day. We will be back again on Friday talking more Nets basketball.